Carl Jung spent decades studying something that most people will never be willing to face. He called it individuation, the process of becoming a complete, whole, fully conscious human being. And here is the uncomfortable truth he discovered along the way. Most people never even start. They live and die inside a version of themselves that was handed to them by society, by fear, and by the unconscious patterns they inherited without ever questioning a single one. But a rare few, and Jung was very clear about this, a rare few operate at a level of psychological awareness so elevated that it genuinely disturbs the people around them. Not because they are arrogant, not because they are strange, but because their very presence forces other people to confront something they have been running from their entire lives. And if you are watching this right now, there is a very real possibility that you are one of those people. So what does it actually look like to possess a more highly differentiated consciousness than the vast majority of people around you? What does it feel like from the inside? And why, if it is such a gift, does it so often feel like a curse? That is the part they never tell you, the part Jung spent his career documenting. That the path to genuine psychological elevation is not peaceful. It is not a wellness trend. It is a war fought entirely within yourself. And today, we are going to go through the 7 signs, rooted in Jung's actual work, that you may already be winning that war without even knowing it. Sign number 1 is that you see through the mask instantly. Jung had a word for the social mask every human being wears. He called it the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient Rome. And according to Jung, the persona is not inherently evil. We all need one. It helps us navigate social situations, professional settings, and the expectations of the world around us. The problem, Jung said, arises when a person over-identifies with their persona so completely that the mask and the self become indistinguishable. The goal of individuation is not to live without a persona. Jung was clear that we always need one. The goal is to wear it consciously, to know you are wearing it, to be able to set it down when you walk through your own door. When that distinction is lost, a person becomes the mask. They stop having an inner life and start performing one. And the tragic part is that most people in your life are doing exactly this without any awareness that it is happening. But if you operate at a greater depth of psychological integration than the people around you, something strange and sometimes unsettling happens in social situations. You notice the performance. You walk into a room, and within minutes you can sense the gap between what someone is saying and what they actually mean. You can feel the anxiety underneath someone's confidence. You can detect the need for validation underneath someone's generosity. You can hear the rehearsed quality in someone's spontaneous laugh. This is not a superpower. This is what Jung described as a natural consequence of having begun your own individuation process. Because once you have started confronting the masks you wear yourself, you develop what we might call differentiated perception. You stop seeing people at face value and you start seeing them at psychological depth. And the correct response to that, Jung would insist, is not detachment or judgment. It is a deepening of empathy. Because when you see the fear underneath someone's performance, you are no longer dealing with a stranger. You are dealing with a fellow human being who is doing exactly what you once did, protecting something fragile with the only tools they have. That is both humbling and, at times, an enormous burden. Consider a composite profile drawn from observed psychological patterns. A person who has done significant inner work finds themselves sitting across from a colleague who is charming, well-liked, and universally praised. While everyone around them is enchanted, this person feels uneasy, not because the colleague is malicious, but because they can sense that the friendliness is defensive, that the warmth is a shield, that beneath the performed confidence, there is something fragile and frightened. They say nothing, but they feel the exhaustion of perceiving a layer of reality that everyone else around them seems immune to. That exhaustion is real, and it is one of the clearest signs that your consciousness has expanded beyond the comfortable flatness of the collective, and the weight of that exhaustion is compounded by something that does not get discussed enough. When you see through people's masks, you do not stop caring about them. What actually happens is that you care deeply and you see clearly at the same time. You sit across from someone you genuinely love, and you see the suffering underneath their performance, and you want to reach past the mask and address the real thing. But the mask is not yours to remove, so you sit with the knowledge, and you hold the space, and you do your best to love both the persona and the person hiding behind it. That is not a skill that comes naturally, and if you have started developing it, consciously or not, it is a clear indicator that your consciousness is operating at a greater depth of psychological integration than most people around you. Sign number 2 is that you experience isolation, not as loneliness, but as necessity. This is the one that surprises people the most, because we are told from the time we are children that isolation is a problem to be fixed. That if you feel alone, something is wrong with you. That belonging is the ultimate goal of a human life. And for the majority of people living inside the collective unconscious, that is actually true. Their psychological health depends on connection with the group, on shared beliefs, shared norms, and shared emotional experiences. The group is their mirror. Without it, they lose themselves. But Jung observed something different in individuals who were genuinely progressing through individuation. He noticed that they began to require solitude, not as a retreat from failure, but as a condition for growth. The deeper they went into themselves, the more they needed quiet space to process what they were finding there. And the more they needed that quiet space, the more the social rituals that used to comfort them began to feel hollow and loud and draining in a way they could not always explain. Jung wrote in his own autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that self-realization is a story of the coming forth of the unconscious into conscious awareness. And that process cannot happen in a crowd. It requires descent. It requires turning inward in a way that is genuinely incompatible with constant social stimulation. If you have noticed that you increasingly prefer real, deep, somewhat uncomfortable conversations over surface-level socializing, you are not antisocial. If you find that you need long stretches of time alone after being with people, not because you dislike them, but because being around them requires you to manage a perceptual overload that other people do not seem to feel, you are not broken. You are individuating, and according to Jung, that process will always carry a cost. The cost is a degree of separation from the comfortable numbness of the collective. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. And here is something Jung observed that is almost never discussed in the popular conversation about introversion and sensitivity. He made a very specific distinction between the isolation of the individuating person and the isolation that comes from psychological damage. The person who isolates out of fear, out of unprocessed trauma, out of an inability to tolerate other people, is not individuating. Jung had a word for that pattern. He called it a regression, a retreat from the demands of development rather than an advance into them. That kind of withdrawal is a contraction, not an expansion. It is making yourself smaller to avoid pain, and it keeps the shadow sealed rather than integrating it. The individuating person, by contrast, is not retreating from the world because the world is too much for them. They are periodically withdrawing from the world because what they are building inside themselves requires quiet and depth that the social world cannot provide. And the crucial difference is that when they return to connection, they bring more of themselves to it. They are more present, more honest, more capable of genuine intimacy, precisely because they gave themselves the space to go inward. Jung himself was known for long periods of intense solitary work, particularly during the years following his break with Freud, when he explored the depths of his own unconscious in what later became known as the Red Book. Accounts of that era describe it as among the most disorienting and transformative chapters of his entire life. The product of that solitude was not withdrawal from humanity. It was a psychology profound enough to illuminate the human condition for generations. Sign number 3 is where things start to get genuinely unsettling. Because this sign is about what happens when your growth makes you a target. Jung described a psychological mechanism he called projection, and understanding it may be the single most important thing you ever do for your mental health. Here is how it works. Every human being carries what Jung called a shadow. The shadow is the part of the psyche that contains everything we have rejected about ourselves, the impulses we are ashamed of, the weaknesses we refuse to acknowledge, the desires we cannot admit to ourselves, the rage we have been taught is unacceptable, the neediness we have buried under a persona of independence. All of it lives in the shadow. And Jung was absolutely clear. The shadow does not disappear when you repress it. It goes underground. And when it has enough pressure built up, it finds a way out, almost always through projection. Projection is the mechanism by which a person, without any conscious awareness, takes their shadow material and dumps it onto someone else. They do not see their own greed. They see your greed. They do not see their own dishonesty. They see yours. They do not see their own profound need for attention. They see your arrogance. And this would just be an annoying quirk of human psychology if it were not for this one devastating detail. The people who are most likely to receive the heaviest projections are the people who have done the most inner work, because your psychological clarity, when it is genuine, acts as a kind of mirror. And there is an important qualification here that Jung would never let us skip over. This mirror only works clearly when you have done enough of your own shadow work. If you still carry unexamined material of your own, if your triggers are still live, then what you call a clear reflection may simply be a mutual projection. Two people's shadows meeting in the middle and pointing at each other. True shadow integration means taking back your own projections first, before assuming that what you are seeing in another person is theirs alone. When that integration is real, when people who have never confronted their own shadow stand near someone who has genuinely done that work, they can sense themselves reflected back, not as they wish to be seen, but as they actually are, and that reflection is intolerable to them, so they attack the mirror. Consider a narrative illustration based on this widely observed dynamic. Someone in a work or family environment who has spent years doing genuine introspective work is suddenly accused by the people closest to them of being cold or judgmental or selfish or distant. The accusations feel completely disconnected from anything they have actually done, and when they try to examine the situation objectively, they cannot find a factual basis for the charges. What is actually happening is that their presence, their groundedness, their refusal to engage in emotional chaos is triggering the shadow material in the people around them. They are not doing anything wrong. Their being is doing the work, and the people around them cannot stand it. If people seem disproportionately bothered by your calm, your clarity, or your refusal to lose yourself in drama, you are probably holding up a mirror someone is not ready to look into. Sign number 4 is that your relationship with time has fundamentally shifted. This is one of the more subtle signs, but once you understand the psychology behind it, it becomes one of the most significant. Most people experience time as a kind of anxiety. The past is a source of regret or nostalgia. The future is a source of worry or fantasy. And the present is just the uncomfortable gap between the two that they are constantly trying to escape. This is the psychology of the person who lives almost entirely inside the collective unconscious. Their sense of self depends on narrative continuity, on the story of who they were and who they hope to become. The present moment, stripped of those stories, feels empty and threatening. But Jung observed that individuals in the deeper stages of individuation began to develop what he described as a consciousness detached from the world. Not indifferent, not numb, but genuinely anchored in the present, in a way that gave them a kind of immunity to the emotional volatility that drives most human behavior. He wrote that individuation creates, as a natural byproduct, an attitude that is beyond the reach of violent shocks and emotional entanglements. Think about what that means. It does not mean you stop feeling. It means your feelings stop controlling you. You can observe an emotion the way you observe weather. You know it is real. You know it will pass. You do not mistake it for a verdict about reality. This is an extraordinarily rare quality, and if you have started to experience it, even partially, even inconsistently, it is one of the clearest indicators that you are operating at a level of psychological integration that most people never approach. And what makes this shift so significant from a Jungian standpoint is that it is not a technique you can learn. It is not a mindfulness practice you perform. It is a natural emergence, a byproduct of genuine shadow integration. When you have faced enough of your own darkness without running from it, when you have taken your projections back from the people you were dumping them onto, something in you begins to settle. The anxiety generated by the gap between your persona and your actual self begins to dissolve. And that movement toward wholeness is what produces the quality of presence that most people only ever experience as a distant philosophical ideal. You stop merely knowing you should be present, and you start actually being present. Not perfectly, not permanently, but with a depth that changes the experience of being alive in a way nothing external ever has. Sign number 5 is that you have stopped trying to resolve the contradictions in yourself. And this is the one that separates the merely self-aware from the genuinely individuated. Most people, when they discover an internal contradiction, experience it as a crisis to be solved. I am kind, but I can also be cruel. I value honesty, but I have lied. I want connection, but I also want to be left alone. The collective psychology responds to these contradictions with judgment and suppression. You pick the trait you are supposed to be, and you push the other one into the shadow. The result is a persona that is more consistent, but psychologically impoverished. A human being reduced to a set of approved characteristics. Jung described something fundamentally different. He wrote that the self, the true totality of who you are, is what he called a coincidentia oppositorum, a Latin phrase meaning a coincidence of opposites. The true self is simultaneously bright and dark, structured and chaotic, giving and self-interested, strong and vulnerable. And the individual who has made genuine progress on the path of individuation has stopped trying to collapse that paradox by eliminating one of its poles. Instead, they have learned to do something far more demanding. They hold both poles in tension simultaneously. They do not resolve the contradiction. They stay inside it, long enough and honestly enough, until something new emerges from the pressure. Jung called this the transcendent function, not a passive tolerance of contradiction, but an active psychic process in which holding the tension becomes the engine of genuine transformation. They no longer need to perform a consistent version of themselves for the comfort of other people. They do not claim to be purely good. They do not pretend to be perfectly rational. They hold the full complexity of their own nature without shame and without the need to reduce it to something simpler. And the world, which is deeply uncomfortable with complexity, finds this profoundly threatening. Because a person who has made peace with their own contradictions cannot be controlled by shame. And that makes them dangerous to every system that relies on shame to maintain order. And this is not a passive state of resignation. People often misunderstand this particular quality in individuals with more differentiated consciousness and mistake it for indifference or moral flexibility. But Jung was describing something very different from that. He was describing the capacity to actively hold the tension between opposing psychological forces without needing to collapse that tension prematurely into a simpler, less honest narrative. The transcendent function is not a comfortable state of balance. It is a creative act. The psyche, when pressed between two genuine opposites, it refuses to resolve by suppression, generates something that was not present in either pole alone, a third perspective, more honest and more whole than anything the ego could have constructed on its own. When you stop trying to edit out the parts of yourself that do not fit the approved image, when you stop performing a consistency that your actual experience of being yourself cannot support, you create the internal conditions for genuine psychological creativity. You become capable of responses to life that are not merely reactive, not merely borrowed from the collective script, but genuinely original, because they emerge from the full depth of who you actually are. Consider a narrative illustration of this principle. A person who has spent years believing they must choose between being strong and being vulnerable, between being independent and being connective, between being honest and being kind, suddenly reaches a point where they stop choosing. They stop performing strength when they feel vulnerable. They stop performing independence when they crave connection. They stop softening their honesty in ways that make it dishonest. And the result is not, as they feared, the collapse of their relationships and their credibility. The result is that the people around them who are capable of real connection are drawn closer, because they are finally encountering a real person rather than a performance. And the people who are only ever comfortable with the performance quietly drift away, which is painful, but which is also, as Jung would say, exactly correct. The relationships that survive your authenticity are the ones worth having. The ones that required your performance were never truly sustaining you in the first place. Sign number 6 is that you have lived through what Jungian psychology calls a metanoia, or what alchemical psychology describes as the nigredo. These are not terms you will hear on a wellness podcast, but they describe something very real and very specific. The metanoia is a fundamental shift of mind, a complete reorganization of the psyche around a new center. The nigredo, borrowed from the language of alchemy, refers to the blackening, the collapse phase, the point at which everything that was constructed on a false foundation is reduced to ash so that something genuine can be built. And this is where the tension we have been building in this video finally breaks open. Because up to this point, the signs we have been discussing are relatively quiet ones: internal shifts, perceptual changes, gradual awakenings. But this is different. It is the moment Jung described as the actual beginning of the individuation process in its most profound form. Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest collaborators, wrote that the individuation process typically begins with a wounding of the personality, a moment where the old self-narrative simply cannot hold together anymore, where the story you have been telling yourself about who you are and why things have happened to you collapses under the weight of reality. This is not a pleasant experience. It is, in fact, often the most disorienting thing a human being can go through, because the identity you have built, the persona you have spent years constructing and defending, suddenly reveals itself as a construction. And the shadow material that you have been successfully repressing begins to surface with a force and clarity that is almost impossible to ignore. Consider a composite example drawn from observed patterns in psychological literature. A person who has spent years defining themselves through external achievement, through being the dependable one, the high achiever, the one who has it all together, is suddenly confronted with a failure or a loss or a betrayal that their persona has no framework to absorb. And in the wreckage of that collapse, something unexpected happens. They stop performing. The energy that was previously directed outward at maintaining an image begins to flow inward toward genuine self-examination. And for the first time in their adult life, they begin to actually see themselves. Jung was clear that this is not a failure. This is an initiation. The wounding he and von Franz described is the precise mechanism by which the ego is made permeable enough to allow the unconscious material to surface and be integrated. Without the wound, the persona remains impenetrable. Without the collapse, the false self never gets replaced by the real one. If you have lived through a moment like this, a moment where everything you thought you knew about yourself was suddenly in question, and if you survived it not by rebuilding the old story, but by building an entirely different and more honest one, you have lived through a metanoia, you have passed through your nigredo, and you emerged from it as what Jung would have described as a psychological genius in hiding. Someone whose awareness of themselves and others is now calibrated to a depth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Sign number 7 is the one that ties everything together. And it is the most powerful, because all 6 of the signs we have discussed up to this point share a common characteristic. They are all things that the average person would describe as problems. Seeing through people is isolating, needing solitude is seen as antisocial, receiving projection is painful, living in the present is disorienting at first, holding contradictions is uncomfortable, and the metanoia, the nigredo, is genuinely devastating before it becomes liberating. So the 7th sign is simply this. You have stopped interpreting your sensitivity as a weakness. You have started to understand it as what it actually is. Jung believed that the most vital urge in every human being is the urge towards self-realization. That the drive to individuate, to become a complete and differentiated psychological individual, is not a luxury or a personality quirk. It is the deepest instinct of the human psyche. And the people who experience all of the signs we have been discussing are not suffering from some psychological defect. They are responding to that instinct with extraordinary courage and honesty. Because the path of individuation is, by definition, the path of going against the current of the collective. It is the path of refusing to remain unconscious when consciousness is being offered to you, even when that offer is painful, even when it costs you relationships, even when it makes you strange in the eyes of people who have chosen comfort over growth. There is a phrase that appears in the work of Jungian psychologist Robert Johnson that captures this beautifully. He wrote in Inner Work that individuation reveals how the universal human traits and possibilities are combined in each individual in a way that is unlike anyone else. That is the final gift of the 7th sign. You are not more enlightened than other people in some hierarchical sense. You are simply more fully yourself. And in a world where the overwhelming pressure of the collective unconscious pushes almost every person toward sameness, toward conformity, toward the comfortable numbness of the unexamined life, being fully yourself is genuinely radical. It is a kind of warrior consciousness, not because it makes you aggressive or superior, but because it requires a sustained act of courage that most people will never be willing to attempt. Now let us talk about what this actually looks like in practice. Because the 7 signs are not abstract philosophical concepts. They show up in the daily texture of your life, in the conversations you can no longer tolerate, in the relationships that suddenly feel too small, in the creative impulses you have been suppressing because they do not fit the persona you built in your 20s, in the recurring feeling that the life you are actually living is slightly to the left of the life you are meant to be living. Jung wrote, in Psychology and Religion, that if you sum up what people tell you about their experiences on the path of individuation, you can formulate it this way. They came to themselves. They could accept themselves. They were able to become reconciled to themselves, and thus were reconciled to adverse circumstances and events. Not that they became perfect, not that they achieved permanent bliss, but that they came to themselves. That is the whole game, and it is available to anyone willing to pay the price of admission, which is, as we have established, not a small price. The price is the willingness to look at your shadow without flinching, to take back your projections and own your darkness as your own, to let the old persona die when it has outlived its usefulness, to sit in the discomfort of not knowing who you are, in the transition between the self you were and the self you are still becoming. Most people are not willing to pay that price, and that, more than anything else, is what separates them from the rare individual Jung was describing. Not intelligence, not spiritual gifts, just the willingness to go inward when the collective is pushing you to stay on the surface. Let us go a little deeper into the shadow, because it is the central mechanism of everything we have been discussing, and it deserves more than a passing mention. Jung described the shadow as the thing a person has no wish to be. Everything that the conscious personality experiences as negative, everything that the ego ideal cannot accommodate, gets pushed into the shadow. And he was emphatic that the shadow is not only made of darkness. Inside the shadow there are also what he called positive qualities, creative impulses, raw emotional energy, authentic instincts, and genuine desires that were suppressed, not because they were evil, but because they did not conform to what the social environment expected. This means that shadow work is not only about confronting your worst impulses, it is about recovering the parts of yourself that you were told were too much. Too intense, too ambitious, too sensitive, too angry, too needy, too alive. Consider a pattern observed across many individuals doing this work. Think about what it means for the person who has been suppressing their creative drive for 20 years because they were told it was impractical, or the person who has been suppressing their authentic anger because they were told it was unattractive, or the person who has been suppressing their need for genuine depth in their relationships because they were surrounded by people who only wanted things to be light and easy. These are not small suppressions. They are amputations of the actual self, and the damage is not only individual. Jung was explicit that unintegrated shadow material at scale is what fuels collective shadow projection. When enough people in a group, a family, or a society dump their unexamined darkness onto a convenient target, the consequences, as history confirms, are catastrophic. But here is the thing about shadow integration that makes it so different from every other model of self-improvement you have ever encountered. You do not improve yourself by eliminating your shadow. You do not get better by cutting off more of yourself. You get better by integrating more of yourself, by bringing the unconscious material into the light of consciousness, where it can be worked with, transformed, and ultimately put in service of the whole. Jung compared this to the fable of the hero who must confront a dragon in order to reach the treasure that is hardest to obtain. The dragon is your shadow, and the treasure on the other side is not some external reward. The treasure is the full version of yourself, the one that was available to you all along, but was locked behind the parts of your psyche you were afraid to face. Now, if you have been following everything we have been discussing, you might be asking yourself a very natural question. What do I actually do with this? Because recognizing yourself in these 7 signs is one thing, But the process of individuation is not a passive recognition. It is an active engagement. Jung himself practiced what he called active imagination, deliberately engaging with unconscious contents through creative and reflective work, dream analysis, and the honest examination of recurring emotional patterns. These were not optional accessories to the process. They were the process. But perhaps the most practical piece of advice Jung ever offered on the subject of psychological growth is also the simplest. He wrote that a life directed toward an aim is in general better, richer, and healthier than an aimless one. That might sound too simple for a man of Jung's intellectual depth, but what he meant was deeply specific. Individuation requires that you take your psychic energy and direct it consciously toward the actualization of your genuine potential, rather than allowing it to be absorbed entirely by the collective, by habit, and by the path of least resistance. It means asking yourself the question most people genuinely never ask. What is the deepest thing trying to emerge from within me? What is the version of myself I have not yet had the courage to become? And what would it require of me to start moving toward it? These are not comfortable questions. They are not the kind of questions that get answered in a single afternoon or a single YouTube video, but they are the only questions that have ever led to a genuinely elevated human life. And the fact that you are here, watching this, and asking them, is itself a meaningful sign. Not because watching a video about Jung is a spiritual achievement in itself, but because the hunger that brought you here, the hunger to understand yourself more deeply than the collective would ever encourage you to, is the same hunger that Jung identified as the most vital urge in every human being. The urge toward self-realization, the urge toward individuation, the urge to become not just a version of yourself designed by your circumstances, but the full, complex, irreducibly unique person that you actually are. And if the 7 signs we discussed today resonate with you, then here is what I want you to hold on to as you leave this video. Your sensitivity is not a disorder. Your need for solitude is not a defect. Your ability to see through personas is not arrogance. Your difficulty tolerating unconscious behavior in others is not a character flaw. Your experience of the metanoia, the negredo, is not a breakdown. It is a breakthrough. Every single one of these qualities, when understood through the lens of Jungian psychology, points in the same direction, toward the completion of a process that most people never begin, toward a version of yourself that is more honest, more whole, more capable of genuine connection, and more immune to the kind of psychological manipulation that only works on people who have never faced their own shadow. Jung wrote that the process of individuation is the most complete expression of individuality and the most vital goal of human life. Not the most comfortable one, the most vital one. The one that the deepest part of you has been moving toward your entire life, whether you had a name for it or not. Now you do. And if you recognized yourself in any of the 7 signs we explored today, then I think you already knew, somewhere underneath all the noise, that you are not like most people. Not better, but more awake. And being more awake, as Carl Jung spent his entire career trying to tell us, is both the hardest thing a human being can be and the most important. The path forward from here is not about achieving some perfect state of enlightenment. It is about continuing the descent into yourself with courage and honesty, understanding that every layer you uncover is bringing you closer to the version of yourself that was always waiting underneath all the conditioning and the masks and the fear. That is the Jungian promise. That is the gift hiding inside every one of the signs we talked about today, even when it costs you, even when the people around you cannot follow you there, because the person waiting on the other side of that work is the person you were always supposed to be. Jung described late-stage individuation as a broadening of consciousness that eventually produces what he was not embarrassed to call wisdom. Not performed wisdom, but the genuine, hard-won kind that can only come from someone who has made peace with the full spectrum of who they are. That is what is available to you on the other side of this important work. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.